Welcome back, everybody, to another amazing episode of The Hopeful Majority. I have to thank you, by the way, for last week's episode, which was a solo episode about the missing story about college campus protests, because that episode did really well. It was one of our most well-watched episodes. I appreciate everybody for supporting this podcast, for supporting the conversation. If you haven't listened to that episode about what is actually happening in college campuses and what we're learning from students on the ground, check it out. YouTube, Spotify, Apple. You can find our content everywhere. Every Monday, we're releasing new content, especially if you're new to the show. Welcome, because today's conversation is another fascinating interview conversation with a current member of Congress, Derek Kilmer from Washington State, and he will actually not be seeking re-election this year, which is why I think this conversation is really honest, really open. I think you'll really appreciate Congressman's perspective. We touch on everything from fixing Congress to what are the challenges that members of Congress face, to the incentive structures in our politics, to, well, why can't people in Congress just get along and get stuff done? I know it's a question a lot of people ask, and I'll warn you, this conversation's a little nitty gritty. We go into things like gerrymandering and primaries and campaign finance. And if you're already listening to this, you're like, Manu, I have no idea about these words. These words are weird technical things. Hang in there, because I think we need to have open, nuanced conversations about the complex problems that face our systems and our institutions. The fact is that a lot of the problems that we face as they relate to polarization and division in our country are not simple binary issues that you can distill into one headline that we can consume. In fact, I think that's one of the problems that our media has created, is this habit and tendency within us to be simple-minded consumers that are just like, hey, this is the issue and that's what the problem is. This is a complex problem set. And I really appreciated the congressman's time, because he went at the challenges that Congress faces and how we can fix them from a I think a very objective, nonpartisan standpoint. So whether you come from the right, you come from the left, you're anywhere across the political spectrum, I think this is a conversation that you'll appreciate. So with that, let's welcome Congressman Kilmer. Congressman Kilmer, welcome back to the Hopeful Majority, sir.
It's good to be back.
I'll say that folks are probably wondering, why is Manu saying you're back when there hasn't been a previous conversation? And it's because we had a wonderful conversation, I thought, 2 weeks ago, but the Longworth Congress Capitol Hill Wi-Fi just did not work out. How is it that we just don't have good Wi-Fi in Washington, D.C.?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about rural broadband. I'd like to say a few words about urban broadband, specifically with regard to the U.S. Capitol campus.
Yeah, it's so odd. I was actually our producer and I were talking about it, and it's fascinating that the world's most powerful country on the planet struggles with Wi-Fi in its capital.
Yeah, it's not great.
But I deeply appreciate you making time.
Yeah, you bet.
For being here. I know how busy everything is. Here's where I want to start. Last time we started with just, the Civic Bridges Act and how you're focused on modernization. But in the 2 weeks that spanned, there was a New York Times video op-ed essay that folks should absolutely check out, where it shows 12 members of Congress retiring and ask them why. And it actually ends with you. And you make the statement at the opening, that is that I knew that I was joining an organization, i.e. Congress, that had a popularity rating that was less than headline colonoscopy. Why did you join?
Yeah, headlights, colonoscopies, and Nickelback, I think, was the poll that I saw. So why did I join? First, it's why did I get into public service? I actually grew up in a little logging town on the coast of Washington State. And when I was in high school, the timber industry kind of took it on the chin. And I saw a bunch of my friends' parents lose their jobs and a bunch of my neighbors lose their jobs. And it absolutely altered the trajectory of my adult life. When I went to Princeton for undergrad, my senior thesis was how do you help timber towns in Washington State? And when I was at Oxford on a Marshall Scholarship, my doctoral dissertation looked at mining towns in the UK and timber towns in Washington, basically trying to figure out what do you do when the main industry that is the community's lifeblood really declines. And I came home. I worked for McKinsey for a few years, mostly trying to get out of student debt, unsuccessfully, I should add, and then took about a 70% pay cut to go work for an economic development organization. in my region, trying to get more jobs in our area and trying to keep some of the jobs we had. And to make a long story maybe slightly less long, I got grumpy and I ran for office. I kept finding myself saying, gosh, you know what government does and doesn't do sure impacts our ability to grow jobs. And finally, some of my friends said, you know, you seem like you have a lot of good ideas and you sure complain a lot. Why don't you go do something about it, pal? And the next thing I knew, I was serving in the Washington State Legislature. And then in 2012, the guy who had been in Congress in this district from the time I was 3 years old called me and said, hey, in about an hour, I'm going to announce that I'm not running again. And you should think about whether that's something you want to do. It wasn't a no-brainer for me. My kids were 3 and 6 at the time. And I was conscious that if I was successful in this undertaking, I'd be signing up for a 3,000-mile commute where I'd be away from them a lot. And two, as you just pointed out, you know, like a lot of Americans, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to touch Congress with a 10-foot pole. And as I thought about it, in the end, perhaps those deterrents were the reason I ended up doing it, was because I had kids and because it was a mess and I didn't want their future dictated by a completely messed up federal government. And that's what got me into this job. And it has absolutely influenced how I've approached the work. I work a lot on economic development issues because that was what really drove me. But two, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we fix our broken politics. You mentioned things like the Building Civic Bridges Act and the Modernization Committee. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of those things. But there's a reason I worked on those things. And it's because, you know, part of the reason I came to this role was my belief that if you want things to work differently, you've got to do things differently.
You know, I want to take a quick step back in your journey where you actually decided that you know you complain a lot and you're going to get into Congress to solve problems, right? Which is, I guess my summarization of a fascinating way to start. And I think a lot of people at this moment have a deep skepticism of members of Congress. A lot of people, especially younger people, I think have a lot of skepticism of a lot of key institutions, whether it's religion, whether it's the government, whether it's the way that our economic systems work. And people question the motivations of public officials a lot. And when I was listening to this video essay, I was hearing these folks talk, and all of them kept saying, I want to fix things. Or you just shared your background and how you got in because you wanted to solve a certain problem set that was motivating you. Why did you choose to run for Congress and pull that lever of change, or the state house, I guess, at that time, or state Congress, as opposed to pulling all the other levers that folks think about, you know, as they think about pursuing change? Why this one?
It's a fair question, you know, and I'm a big believer that there's a lot of ways to make a difference, right? Even, you know, I mean, President Kennedy said in a democracy, we all hold office.
Mm-hmm.
And the important role that Americans play in trying to influence their government is one way of impacting change. You know, I have friends who work for nonprofits and think tanks who are absolutely altering the trajectory of our country. I have friends
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I have friends who, you know, are university professors who similarly are, you know, are molding minds and driving thinking on issues that matter. And so I'm a believer that there's a lot of ways to make change. One of them is running for office. And to me, initially the opportunity to have impact at the state level held appeal to me. And if I'm candid with you, part of the issue for me was, as someone who worked in economic development, I saw an avenue to sort of drive thinking in that space. And also at the time, I was represented by someone who didn't share my values. And I thought, well, what an opportunity to try to influence my community in a way that might actually drive positive change, maybe rather than driving headlines. The second thing, you know, the second piece is why Congress. And I think the challenge right now is there's a lot of folks who look at Congress and say, man, I'm not sure that's a place that you can make change. And then that gets risky, right? If there's a, you know, if creates some peril for democracy. And so for me, it was in the end a draw. There's puts and takes and all of that, right? You know, there's ups and downs in Congress, and I'm happy to tell you about ups and I'm happy to tell you about downs. But for me, I'm a genetically hopeful person, and I really believe that through service I could make a difference. And
So,
let
I
me
mean,
just tell you one other quick thing,
please.
I mean, I think you'd find it interesting. When I chaired the Modernization Committee, which is the thing called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, it was nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee. And we started off with something that, to my knowledge, no other committee in Congress does. We held a bipartisan planning retreat. And we went around the room and just sort of as an icebreaker, we started with two simple questions. Why did you come to Congress? And how has it met or failed to meet your expectations? And it was really interesting because if you had sat, if you sat as a fly on the wall in that room, I'm not sure you would have been able to tell who the Republicans were and who the Democrats were. But there was a constant theme that people felt like the institution was punching below its weight and that they wanted to make a difference to make it better. And I think there's really something to that.
That the institution is punching below its weight. What do you think prevents the institution from actually punching punching above its weight? And I know that's a very broad question, but I can imagine someone listening to this right now and saying, let's say I disagree with the congressman's politics, but I do agree with what you're saying right now, which is you're
Yeah.
being relatively introspective about the institution. You're saying, hey, I got in it for the right reasons. I even have this committee that folks probably have never heard of called the Select Committee on Modernization.
Right.
Why do you think people are not punching above their weight in Congress? And I guess what does that actually mean for the institution to be doing well?
Well, I have a very long answer to this, and I'll try to make it as short as I can. But I would think about this when the Modernization Committee was established. So the first part of the answer is when the Modernization Committee was established, it was a trend of, every 20 or 30 years, Congress realizes things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to see if they can fix it, right? And this was the most recent iteration of that. And, by and large, these committees don't do anything. But and I'm happy to talk about some of the things we were able to do. But we were assigned a few topics that were, I think, sort of part of help define a problem statement. The types of problems we were asked to look at were, how can Congress better be an institution that can recruit, retain, and train and develop diverse staff, where the staff of Congress looks like the staff of America. The problem statement with that is, by and large, the tenure of congressional staffers is about 3 years, which means as the institution develops knowledge, it loses it quickly to lobbying firms or nonprofits or what have you. So that's a problem, not to mention the fact that congressional staff is not, and particularly senior staff, don't have the diversity that I think the American people would want to see.
It's just one thing I'll just there's it's only 3 years.
3 years
Wow.
is the average
Wow.
tenure. Yeah. So, you develop knowledge and then you lose it very quickly.
Wow.
Second, one of the things we were asked to look at was technology. Congress has been described as an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. And I found that largely to be true. Now we're working on changing that. But just as an example, when I showed up in Congress, I was given a pager. I think I still have it. I don't think I've ever turned it on, and I'm not entirely sure how to use it or what it's for.
It's going to beep during this recording. The one time it beeps
Yeah.
in your life is during this recording.
It might. So we were asked to look at how to modernize technology. We were asked to look at things like rules and procedures to make the institution function better. We were asked to look at issues related to the schedule and calendar, which, like, we could spend 5 minutes just talking about how the schedule of Congress inhibits the ability of the institution to get things done. In that, one, Congress isn't there enough. If you watch that New York Times video, you heard people talk about, well, it used to be that members lived in Washington, D.C. And part of the challenge right now is, if you look back pre-COVID, the year before COVID hit, members of Congress were in D.C. 65 full days and 66 travel days, meaning we traveled to and from D.C. more than we had full days in D.C. By and large, committees only meet on the full days. And so you're trying to pack all of the work of Congress, if you, as I believe, think that policy making should be done in committees, into 65 days. Not to mention the fact, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, the average member of Congress is on 5.4 committees and subcommittees. So all of them are getting packed into 65 days, meaning members of Congress, by and large, aren't in their committees. They're jumping from committee to committee. showing up, making a 5-minute speech that they can throw up on social media, and then saying, peace out, I'm going to run to my next committee, which means they're not learning in committee. They're not participating in the give and take and the defense of ideas, or even in just the basic, use of evidence to create public policy. So we were asked to look at that issue. So there's all of these things that we were asked to look at in the modernization committee. But I actually think that there's two other things that, if you ask me, like, why isn't it working? I think there's two other things that I think are worthy of consideration. Some of them are will issues and some of them are skill issues. On the will side, there are things that make collaboration difficult. And I would identify three of them. The way we do political primaries in most states, it's closed primaries, meaning, someone talking to someone on the other side of the aisle, or God forbid, trying to solve a problem with someone on the other side of the aisle, may get them punished in a political primary. Two is partisan gerrymandering, where our blue districts have gotten a lot more blue and our red districts have gotten a lot more red. And some of that is because we have, in many states, politicians choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials. And then three is the role of money in politics. I think there's too much money in our political system, and that absolutely drives behavior. So some of those are what I would call will issues. The other is skill issues. Congress is the only place in which I've worked where, with the exception of freshman orientation, there is no professional development for the people who work there. Literally zero. There are basic tools required for an institution, for a legislative body to function well. It's things like, how do you use evidence to develop public policy, and how do you negotiate strategically, and how do you resolve conflict, and how do you talk to people who disagree with you, and how do you manage an office? And by and large, there are some people who come to Congress with those skills, and some somehow develop those skills organically. But by and large, there's a whole bunch of folks in the institution who do not do that, do not have those skills. And that becomes problematic for the institution as well. And that's not, me dissing my colleagues. I think most of my colleagues would agree with that assessment, that it is a problem for the institution that we have not, that you show up in the institution and there's very little. There are ways to develop content knowledge on policy issues, but from a skills standpoint, there's not a lot of ways to get better at the job. So those are three. I know, literally, I hope you can tell, I think a lot about this stuff.
Yeah.
We could spend an hour just on that question.
Well, let me ask you a very specific question there,
Sure.
which is, and that was incredibly helpful. I mean, every time I speak with you, which has now been 3 times, each time I take notes on learning, and I can imagine someone listening to this, they're like, Congressman just spoke for 4 minutes. The fact is, this stuff is nuanced, it's complicated, and that's part of the reason why we've built this medium, is to give you the chance to really explain your experience, given that you've been there for a time that I think allows you the ability to talk about it. Here's the very specific question that I hear somebody asking right now, which is, how much do you think the problem is bad people running and being in Congress, as opposed to the structure and the institution and a lot of the deficiencies that you just outlined?
The thing that I would tell you is, I often get asked what surprised you most when you got to Congress. And one of the things that surprised me most was just how impressive a lot of the people were. There are good people who choose to give up whatever they're doing back home and come serve in this legislative body. The other thing that surprises me is, in the aggregate, it is not punching at a level it should. And so that suggests to me that some of these systemic issues are big deals. To have colleagues say, gosh, I'd love to work with you on that, but I think I'd get beaten in a primary. That's a systemic problem. And you could argue that has to do with the person, but the person wants to be able to deliver for their district. And many of them say, well, I'm not able to deliver for my district or for my country if I get beat by some extremist in a primary because of a position I took or something that I chose to work on. So it's a little tricky, but I don't think I'm surrounded by bad people. Now, I will tell you, there are, I'm a big fan of Amanda Ripley's writing and her book, High Conflict. And she has this concept called conflict entrepreneurs, people who profit off of, stirring the conflict. And Lord knows there are conflict entrepreneurs in Congress. We see that playing out right now with regard to the attempt by Marjorie Taylor Greene to vacate the chair. That's conflict entrepreneurship, right? That's her trying to profit and raise her profile, which I don't think serves the institution or the American people.
This dynamic between this vocal minority of members of Congress dominating the narrative, serving certain sets of incentive structures that don't incentivize governing, don't incentivize necessarily solving problems, reminds me actually of what we're seeing on college campuses right now, which is that, when we're on campus, we've got all these college chapters across the country. Most students on campus want to have the conversation, they want to have the dialogue, they want to listen, and yet they feel like there's this vocal minority that's created this culture of fear where you can't necessarily have the dialogue, you can't necessarily have the conversation. um, do you think that that dynamic is relevant? And how do you think you elevate, again, I don't like to use the phrase silent majority because of its historical implications, but how do you elevate the majority of people, whether it's in Congress, whether it's on a college campus, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's at your church,
Yeah.
that want to have the civic fabric, not to have the civic conflict?
Well, I think that takes work. I really do. Let me tell you, I mean, so I'm going to answer that question, but I think just to highlight the problem statement, there were two polls last year that caused me a loss of sleep. And I like to sleep. So that, one was an NBC News poll that found that 70% of Americans agree with the statement that America is so divided, it is no longer capable of solving big problems. The second was a battleground poll that asked Americans on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being no conflict and 100 being civil war, where do they rate the United States? And the median score was a 70, meaning Americans thought by and large we were more than 2/3 of the way to civil war. Now I hear those numbers, and it'd be very easy to say, well, that's just life in America in 2024. But I don't know about you. I sort of refuse to just accept that as, well, I guess we're not going to do big things as a country anymore, or I guess we're just going to be in persistent conflict all the time. I saw that in my district, and that was the genesis of the Building Civic Bridges Act. I had two things happen over the course of about a month that were really shaking. One was I got invited to a YMCA thinking they were going to talk to me about gymnasiums losing money during the pandemic. It's not what they wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk to me about the fact that fights were breaking out at the Y over politics. And they said it's become so bad that we can't ignore it anymore. So they said they've hired a consultant that was training their staff and training their board in conflict resolution. And they were starting to try to pull together what they were calling bridging events to get people to talk through their differences rather than having, the Jerry Springer show break out on the elliptical, right? And
I'd pay for that.
Yeah, for sure. And at the end of the conversation, someone said to me, just out of curiosity, is there any federal support for something like this? And I said, not really, not as far as I know. That same month, we unfortunately had a series of attacks on religious institutions in Tacoma. We had the Islamic Center got burned to the ground by an arsonist. We saw two Buddhist faith leaders get assaulted outside their temple. We saw a church get vandalized, all within the span of about 3 weeks. And in the spirit of something good coming out of something bad, an interfaith solidarity group organized, and they put together a solidarity event at Tacoma Community College. And I have to tell you, in my entire time in office, it was one of the most powerful experiences that I had, because it was a group of people, and if you could think of a religion, they were there, largely there to say, hey, part of living in a healthy, diverse, religiously diverse and otherwise diverse pluralistic democracy is you're going to live next to people who think and look and pray differently than you do. And it cannot come to violence and conflict. And afterwards, one of the faith leaders approached me and said, that was a pretty powerful 90 minutes. And I said, it was. He said, just out of curiosity, if we were going to do this right, we would do this in an ongoing way. Any federal support to help something like that if we were trying to do that? And I said, I don't think so. And I looked into it. As it turns out, the United States actually does spend tens of millions of dollars each year trying to build social cohesion and foster bridges across lines of difference as a means of strengthening democracy in other countries through the National Endowment for Democracy. But we do not do that here in America. And so we went to work on legislation called the Building Civic Bridges Act. And it's a bipartisan bill. When we introduced it in the last Congress, it was with 10 Democratic sponsors and 10 Republican sponsors. And the bill really focuses on three things. One, providing federal support to those hyper-local efforts to try to bridge divides, to try to have some of these difficult conversations in a way that, dials down the conflict, in a way, the people who are doing the work. Two, it would train AmeriCorps members in the skills related to bridge building. We know we have extraordinary Americans that are participating in the AmeriCorps program that are basically populating amazing nonprofits and park districts all over America's school districts. And they're force multipliers in this effort to build the skills related to bridge building, because that is not,
Right.
that's a skill. And, we've seen it erode in our country a bit. And then finally, it would support colleges and universities that are doing research in this space. My lead Republican sponsor is a guy named Andy Barr, who has the Henry Clay Center in his district, and they're doing extraordinary work trying to figure out how do we bridge some of these divides in our country and make sure that civility and compromise and collaboration aren't naughty words, but are aspirations for progress in our country.
I want to hold on some of the pieces of the Building Civic Bridges Act, because I think it's fascinating to see Congress federally actually invest, given the experience that you had at the YMCA, given sort of the religious violence you saw in your community. And I asked you a version of this question the last time we spoke, but I want to ask it in an even more pointed way, which is, why do you think Congress and the federal government had taken so long to act on the divides propping up in the United States? And why do you think this problem set of polarization has taken so long to actually catch on as a serious thing for people to focus on? And I'll just underscore this really quickly.
Yeah.
When we first started Bridge USA in that first ever discussion in 2017, like our freshman year, way back, at least to me, it feels way back. I know that in the time history of the world, it's not way back.
Yeah.
I remember people used to say, like, oh, Manu, all you're doing is just getting a bunch of people to talk to each other. Like, what's so important about that? And honestly, I would say that's exactly what we're doing. And we would use social science to explain why that's important, but also to show that it's literally not happening. But just by that retort of all you're doing is getting a bunch of people to talk to each other, I'm sure you get a version of that critique about the act and about the bill. Why do you think this problem has not been higher priority as a serious threat to our democracy?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. I think there's a few things at play. And to be clear, the Building Civic Bridges Act hasn't passed into law either.
Right.
So we've seen some bipartisan interest in it. I can't promise you that Congress is going to take this as seriously as it should. I think there's an understanding and appreciation for the fact that our founders did not presume that we would agree with each other on everything, right? In fact, they knew we wouldn't. But there was some presumption that we could live together. And I think we have seen, unfortunately, some challenges on that front, where the level of polarization and toxicity is heightened, in part for all the reasons that social science has discovered, right? We're sorting geographically. We're most assuredly sorting with regard to the information we get from everything from cable news to the algorithms and our news feeds on the internet that make sure that we only hear things that affirm our worldview rather than challenge us to think otherwise. And so I think we're seeing things get more ingrained, that polarization sort of being amplified and exacerbated in a way that people didn't expect. And we're not necessarily great at solving problems that we didn't see coming. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't shift towards trying now. And that, I think, is some of the argument around the Building Civic Bridges Act. The other thing I would tell you is, you asked why Congress hadn't necessarily embraced this problem statement. One of the things that I observed when I got to Congress is that there's a lot of blue team versus red team problems in the institution. Even where we can find agreement, sometimes there's an attempt to, snatch defeat from the claws of victory by trying to turn something into a political issue that ought not be. And
Right.
that's because of politics. That's because, they who hold the gavels hold the power. And so there is a persistent struggle for power in the institution. And honestly, that frame and the challenges that are part of that frame absolutely influenced how I approached the work of the Modernization Committee. Because I
Mhm.
said, like, well, so what if we don't do it that way? And I'm happy, if you want, I'm happy to talk a little bit
Well,
about how we changed it up. But
we're gonna go there, but there's something
yeah,
fascinating that you just elucidated, which is that there's a struggle for power at the core of the institution, which begs the question: is the institution serving the struggle for power, or is the institution actually serving the American people? And I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking right now.
yeah.
And what would you say to those folks in terms of how you think about that dichotomy?
I would say that the answer is both. And on a lot of the big issues facing the country, too often it seems to be serving the political divide, but that doesn't mean that's how it needs to be. For Americans who want it to be better, my encouragement is, like, make sure your politicians know that. Make sure your elected officials know that. Um, I shared with you, and I'll get it wrong, but the Kennedy quote, the full quote is, the in our system of government, we all hold office, and the manner in which we execute those responsibility gives us the government that we deserve. And so if we as Americans demand something better, I actually think we might be able to make some progress on that front.
Hmm. If we as Americans demand something better, now I can imagine that the definition of better means something different to everybody. I'm
Sure.
sure this is something that you see in your constituency, in your district, and across the
Yeah.
country, which is like there isn't this singular definition of what is good, right? There is no
Sure.
singular definition of what a good North Star looks like.
Yeah.
And it comes to this question of the Building Civic Bridges Act. I'm sure if any random person like me heard of this act and they were like, there's 10 members of Congress on the red and blue teams each that are trying to bring the country together and passing legislation, that feels like a slam dunk. And yet it hasn't passed yet. Maybe you could explain a little bit as to of some of the obstacles, perhaps, that you're willing to share as to why that bill is struggling, so that people can get a little bit of an insight into just the nitty gritty of the obstacles that folks face.
Well, probably the biggest challenge is just Congress is not exactly a legislative juggernaut right now. I mean, in the last year, I think only 40 bills passed into law in total, and that's out of
What is
thousands.
that? Yeah, what is that relative to, by the way? Like how have previous years been? Like if last year's 40, what a
It's
previous.
historically low. I mean, it's
Yeah.
historically low. Now, as you know, and I think as your viewers and listeners know, oftentimes a bunch of bills get put into one bill, right? So it's a little bit misleading.
Mhm.
But this has been a historically underperforming Congress, unfortunately. And some of that's just explained by the agenda of the majority in the House, and some of it's explained by the fact that we spent, a whole lot of time trying to elect a speaker twice.
Hmm. Hmm. The revolving door that is the speakership of the House of Representatives. It's interesting. One of our students asked us actually recently, this congressman, which is that the reason why we started the speaker battle seems to be because you had 3 or 4 members of Congress on the Republican side hold up the entire nomination. And
Yeah.
my immediate thought there is if you can have an entire institution, again, whether it's your workplace, your church, your community center, or Congress being held hostage by 3 people, the question becomes how do you balance the way that power splits out? And do you think it's an incentive problem? Do you think it's a will issue? Do you think it's a skill issue? Do you think it's a
Yeah,
combination? It's
I
both?
do. Well, a little bit of both. I mean, here's the way I think about it. I live in a town called Gig Harbor, Washington, which is known as the Maritime City. So I use a lot of maritime analogies. I guess the way I
Okay.
look at it is, you've got a situation where somewhere along the lines of, 45% of the folks in the boat want to row in one direction, and you've got 45% of the boat who want to row in another direction. And sometimes it's not dramatically a different direction, but it's a different direction. And then you got about 10% of the people in the boat who just actively have their oars out of the water trying to beat everybody else over the head. That's a problem, right? Because the seas are rocky enough, and it just makes it hard to get where you need to go. The world is complicated, right? We have some really complex matters, and there are conflict entrepreneurs, to use Amanda Ripley's expression, who want to profit off of that, right? Who want to profit off of having their oars out of the water, taking hefty swings at their colleagues. That is problematic.
And part of that, if you stick with that analogy for a second, I'm just thinking about this in the morning. I was doing some media calls with different press outlets, and I can already hear them listening to this conversation. And what's even more interesting is that it's not just that those 10 people with the oars are smashing everybody else, but the people on the sidelines, the spectators, are actually cheering them on. So it's like the 45 people on both sides have their rows in the water. They're at least trying to row in some direction, and then everybody else is cheering those 10 people on. And the natural question then becomes, well, is it the fact that those 10 people are now playing to the incentives of everybody else, or is it that we actually need to change the way that we as people are also rewarding members of Congress in what we're looking at? How do you
Well,
how
so
do you think about that?
this is where I actually think, I get to those will issues, right?
Mhm.
I don't think it's an accident that the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach President Trump, and I don't presume anybody's perspectives on that issue, but disproportionately they were members who were either retiring or from states that had a top two primary
Hmm.
or some different form of a primary. That was freeing to them, right? Folks like a Dan Newhouse or Jamie Herrera Butler or David Valadao, because it was a top two primary, I think felt more empowered to vote the way they thought they felt. That is trickier in a closed primary system where frankly, even in a top two primary system, there can be a penalty for bucking your party. But it's far worse in a closed primary system. So my theory of the case, and I know that there's academics that are researching the various primary systems, both with regard to what it means for politics, but also what it means for governance. And I would argue, and I saw it also with President Obama on trade policy. You saw members more inclined to support President Obama on trade and buck their Democratic members who bucked the rest of the party. And I think they were somewhat liberated by, members being in top two primary states or ranked choice voting states to vote how they actually thought. I know this from my early tenure when I supported President Obama's position on trade, and I had Democratic colleagues say, "Man, I think you're totally right on this, but I'm not sure I can vote that way because I'd just get killed."
Mm.
That's hard. That is a hard dynamic, and I think among the big systemic issues that I think we ought to be talking about and looking at are primary reform. I also think that partisan gerrymandering and the role of money in politics are huge contributors to those like big systems that incent people to sometimes do the wrong stuff, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene pulls her oar out of the water and beats everybody over the heads, and right now she raised a bunch of money off of it. That's a problem.
Mhm. And people cheer her on. And then they
Absolutely.
actually might even throw her a bigger oar so she can hit you on the head with an even bigger weight. I guess within the three things that you listed, gerrymandering, primaries, and money in politics, uh, given that we have to always think about problems as limited times and we can't necessarily solve everything maybe at once, or perhaps you could, but how would you rank those three in sort of prevalence or challenge to the incentives to actually legislate?
I don't know. I think I think it's a good question for political science. My gut is that the primary issue is a really big deal. I think the role of money in politics is a really big deal, and I think partisan gerrymandering is a really big deal.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm very proud of the work of the Modernization Committee, but I will say, in all honesty, that I tried to have our committee take on some of those three big issues, but I couldn't get bipartisan agreement on any of the three.
Hmm.
So that makes it difficult. Our committee was established with 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and a requirement that we get a supermajority vote for putting forward any reforms.
Hmm.
And I could not get 2/3 vote on changing up primaries or changing the role of money in politics or changing how district boundaries are drawn. And that if we want to get serious about how to make Congress function better, I really do think that those 3 issues require a lot more attention.
Hmm. I know we don't have the time to go through each issue, but I can imagine someone asking you, but why is there not bipartisan support? Is it possible for you to maybe just give like a quick explanation of why you think maybe you don't see bipartisan support around, the primary reform, or maybe, why you don't see necessarily bipartisan support
Well,
on the
so
role of money
where
politics?
primary reform has happened, it's by and large happened by ballot measure, by citizen initiative. And so, in Alaska, where they now have ranked choice voting, I believe in Maine also, where they have ranked choice voting, that was done by citizen initiative, I believe. Um, Washington State, where we have a top 2 primary, that was done by ballot measure, and the parties opposed it. California, that was done by ballot measure. The systems aren't necessarily designed to reduce the role of parties. And
Mhm.
so that type of reform is usually opposed by the parties. Um,
Mm.
so that's for one. On the partisan gerrymandering front, the House passed under Democratic leadership both campaign finance reform and reform to gerrymandering so that there would be nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And it died in the Senate. And it didn't die because of lack of support by Democrats. It died in support because of the filibuster and the fact that Republicans didn't support that. And I don't say that to be partisan. That's just a statement of fact. Mitch McConnell has been outspoken in his opposition to most campaign finance reform measures. He believes that we should unlock more money into the system. I just think that's wrongheaded, but that's his perspective. And
Mm.
that's why he's opposed and has pushed the Senate Republicans to oppose really any reform in that space. Now,
And I
having
bet
said
it
that,
that
like,
could I just hold on
yeah,
one thing there, which is I bet that it also doesn't help the case that only Democrats passed this reform or that reform, because I assume then the media can play on that and suddenly people think, "Oh, this is a Democratic issue," as opposed to it being a bipartisan issue.
well, I think you'll appreciate this because I'm part of a bridging group. I co-chair a bridging group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a group that meets for breakfast every week. It's sort of a meeting in 3 parts. First part of the meeting, anybody who wants to make a pitch is able to pitch something that they're working on. Second part of the meeting, we talk about what's going on in Congress that week. And, those can be feisty conversations, right? If you're talking about healthcare or immigration or taxes, people can have sharp elbows, but I'm increasingly of the belief that good democracy is a little bit like a good relationship. You have to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other. And then the third part of the meeting, we usually bring in an outside expert to talk about a big, hairy issue facing the country and how we might be able to find some common ground on those issues. And a few years ago, we brought in Trevor Potter, who was John McCain's campaign finance attorney. I had seen him because he was Stephen Colbert's attorney for his fake super PACs, People for a Better Tomorrow. And
Mhm.
he came in and he said, you know what? I'm not going to talk to you guys about Citizens United. You're not going to get agreement on it. I'm not going to talk to you about public financing of campaigns. You're not going to get agreement on it. And he's a Republican. He said, but I do want to talk to you about something I think you could actually agree on. It's reforming the Federal Election Commission. He said the Federal Election Commission was set up after Watergate, basically to be the referee to blow the whistle on candidates that cheat and on campaigns that cheat. And he said for a long time it worked until it didn't. And now the FEC is almost as dysfunctional as Congress.
Mm.
And he said, so here are some common sense ways in which you could change that and get the referee back on the field. He said to my Republican colleagues in the room, you should like these reforms because right now you have a federal agency employing a bunch of people and not getting anything done. And to my Democratic friends in the room, you should like this because you want to have integrity to our campaign finance laws. And when he was done, I said, hey, I'm willing to work on that if there's a Republican who's willing to work with me. And there were 2 Republicans in the room who said, I will work with you on that. We spent months working on a bill. And then when
Mm.
we introduced it, it was the first bipartisan campaign finance reform bill in more than a decade. And, to me, that highlights the value of bridging. That was included in the big HR1, big democracy reform bill by Democrats. Now, I would argue if we had been able to carve that bill out and run it as a standalone measure, we might have been able to get it passed into law, and we would have made incremental improvement.
Yeah.
That is not repeal Citizens United. That is not public financing. That is not, reining in super PACs. But it could at least say, hey, let's at least, enforce the laws that we have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can imagine someone listening saying, "Man, I never heard of that, and I wish I had." And I can imagine. I'm sure that's
You've just described most of my congressional tenure.
But it highlights something. It's same. I look. The work we do is not well paying. It doesn't get a lot of attention, though. I will say that I think things are shifting. I think with the protests we're seeing right now, I think with members like you bringing a lot of these issues to the forefront, at least I'm seeing the problem set become more relevant.
Yeah.
But you just highlighted and went through this conversation about the Building Civic Bridges Act, the Modernization Committee in Congress, which you've called the IT help desk. You mentioned the bipartisan campaign finance reform. You focused a lot on trying to get stuff done. And this reminds me of what happened after October 7th, Congressman, where after October 7th, we had 21 of our college campuses host amazing discussions on Israel and Palestine, and we completely failed in telling the story of success. And I feel like a lot of this is not necessarily us doing good work. It's actually being effective storytellers and shaping narratives. It feels like norms change work at the end of the day. What do you think about that statement? And why do you think there's not much coverage and engagement?
Well, there's two separate questions there. I want to start.
Let's abandon that last one because I think we'll spend a lot of time on it. Let's focus on the first piece.
Well, so if it's all right, I want to talk a little bit about the Modernization Committee because it was all about norms change, right? The Modernization Committee, as I mentioned, by and large, these select committees don't accomplish anything. And in fact, when Speaker Pelosi asked me, hey, do you want to run this committee? My first thought was, gosh, what did I do to offend you? Because more often than not,
you're really honest, which I appreciate. I can imagine someone's being like, Congressman said, I don't know, and these committees don't accomplish a lot of things. So I hope that only furthers the credibility of the conversation.
Well, so I started off and I got a briefing from the Congressional Research Service, and they went through the history of these reform committees. And they were great in explaining, they were like, in the failed effort of this year and in the largely mediocre effort of this year. And I was like, well, how do we when history looks at this effort, how do we have them look at it and say in a pretty effective and positive, example? And my theory of the case is you just have to fundamentally change the norms. So let me give a few examples. When a congressional committee is created, they get funded. And the first thing that happens is Democrats take their half of the money. They use it to hire people with a Democratic background who put on blue jerseys, and the Republicans take their half of the money and they hire people with a Republican background who put on red jerseys. And then they spend the rest of the time fighting with each other. And so one of the first things I did when I became chair of this committee is I called Tom Graves, who was my Republican counterpart, a very conservative Georgia Republican, a very genial guy, but from a very deep red district, so deep red that when he left Congress, that district is now represented by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I called Tom and I said, Tom, I got a crazy idea for you. What if we don't split the money? What if we just have one committee with one staff, one budget, and you and I agree that we'll hire everybody together? And some of them will be people with a Democratic background and some will be people with a Republican background. But they'll all put on jerseys that say, hey, let's fix Congress. And to Tom's credit, he said, I think my leadership's going to hate this idea, but let's try it. And so that was a tone changer, right? The second thing we did is we held a bipartisan planning retreat, as I mentioned. To my knowledge, I've never been part of a functional effort that didn't start by saying, hey, what do we want to get done? And how do we define success? And by and large, that does not happen in Congress, and it most assuredly doesn't happen in a bipartisan way. If you watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you have too much time on your hands. But if you watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you'll notice
I do.
Yeah. So we didn't sit with Democrats on one side of a dais and Republicans on the other. We sat Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. Why? Well, I would hear a witness say something interesting, and my genetic predisposition is to lean over to the person next to me and say, hey, that was pretty interesting. What do you think about that? And in our committee, we're leaning over to someone from a different party. We didn't even sit at a dais. We sat at a round table, because you can't have good conversation speaking to the back of somebody's head. You need to be able to look them in the eye and actually have dialogue and discussion, not debate. And those things were not cosmetic. I mentioned most of these committees don't pass anything. Our committee passed 202 bipartisan recommendations, every single one of them supported by Democrats and Republicans on the committee, and some for some very significant changes to how Congress works. Now, that is not going to fix Congress overnight. And you said you saw the thing I did for the New York Times. I explained, frequently someone will say, well, so you ran a committee trying to fix Congress. Bang up job, pal. Clearly it's fixed. And I've started quoting the House chaplain, who I saw during the 15th vote for Speaker of the House. And I said to her, pray harder. And she put her hand on my elbow and she said, just imagine how messed up this place would be if I wasn't praying so hard. And so that's kind of how I think about the work of the Modernization Committee. We have made changes, some of which are having impact right now, some of which will be a slow burn, and I think over time will improve the institution. Some we've got to, so far of the 202 recommendations, about a third have been implemented, or a third are in the process of getting implemented, a third we've got to get out of the parking garage. But over time, I think that's going to make a positive difference on the institution. So that I share that with you because you asked, do I agree with the theory of the case that you have to change up norms? That's what this, so I came from a state legislature where every bill was brought up under an open rule, meaning if you had an amendment that was germane to the bill, you could offer it, it would be debated, and it would be voted on. In 8 years of the Washington State Legislature, I can think of maybe 5, maybe 6 times where that was used as a political, weapon, where someone decided I'm going to put forward an amendment just to screw with the other side. If you imagine, it's laughable in Congress to imagine taking up every bill under an open rule. People would weaponize it right, left, and center every single day. But there was no rule in the Washington State Legislature saying, hey, don't be a jerk. That was the norm. The norm was, we're not going to weaponize this because someday we'll be in the minority or in the majority, and we don't want them to weaponize it. We're going to try to make policy, understanding that we have differences, profound differences between the two parties in terms of ideology, but we're not going to play games. And one of the things I strongly believe is the nations with whom we compete are not farting around with politics. They're not trying to, vacate the chair. They're not trying to, shut down the government. They're not doing these sorts of things that are really playing, political bull. They want to eat our lunch, and I don't think we ought to let them. And so my theory of the case is we've got to do things differently. We've got to change up those norms because that's important for the future of our democracy, and it's important for the future competitiveness of our nation.
I want to end with this. Because I don't want to add anything more to that because I think that's very well said. I can imagine also people thinking, well, should we have authoritarian models of governance? But that's a conversation for later. And
we shouldn't.
I don't think anybody would agree with that. No. But here's the thing. Right now I'm listening to this and I get asked this question a lot. A lot of our students get asked this question a lot, which is, why should we run for office? Do you even want to run for office, right?
Yeah.
And one of my fears oftentimes about having these conversations, Congressman, as I sit here and think about this question a lot, is that we just spent, a long time critiquing the challenges, the problems, the issues, making fun of the institution. And yet if the institution fails, we have nothing else, right? What would your words be to a young person right now, or anybody, frankly, that's like, I do want to make a difference and I do want to publicly serve, but it looks like a shit show. So why should I?
Well, I guess I have a different perspective on the 50 minutes that we've spent together, because in my view, we were talking about leaders in Congress who have a sense of agency, who are identifying problems and are committed to trying to fix those problems. That's the
And
thing,
you're one of
right?
them.
Absolutely, right? And so I don't share these problem statements with a sense of, oh God, this is unfixable, right? I mean, it's funny. One of my favorite quotes is from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he talks about the difference between hope and optimism. He says, optimism is a passive virtue. It's the belief that things will get better. And hope is an active virtue. It's the belief that together we can make things better. He says it doesn't take courage to have optimism, but it does take courage to hope. I like that because it understands that we have a sense of agency, right? That when we work together, we can actually make things better. And that's the nature of politics. That's the nature of government. You know, it's been said that government is the problems that we solve together. And I like that because we have, we live in an extraordinary country. We cannot put our head in the sands and say, and yet, we can't be Kevin Bacon at the end of Animal House saying, stay calm, everything's fine, right? There are things that need fixing. And the question is, do we throw up our hands? Do we do one of two things? So what, again, I'm conscious that I am using a lot of quotes, but when I started the work on the Modernization Committee, someone gave me a speech by John Gardner, who was a cabinet member for Lyndon Johnson. He was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And he talked about the importance of being a loving critic of an institution. That's what stewardship was like. Whether you're talking about Congress or your college or university or a nonprofit, he talked about the importance of being a loving critic. And he said institutions suffer as a consequence of one of two things. Uncritical lovers who fail to give an institution the sort of life-giving criticism required for improvement, or unloving critics who treat an institution like the piñata at the party and have an eye towards destruction rather than toward building it up and improving it. I hope as you hear my commentary on Congress, you see it through the lens of someone who really is trying to be a loving critic of the institution, who sees its faults, but is very committed to trying to make it better, and with a mission of making it better for the American people. And I hope that anybody who is contemplating running for office will recognize, one, that there is tremendous opportunity for impact. I mean, heck, I turned my doctoral dissertation and a bunch of smart work that other people did into a law that is now the most popular program in the history of the Economic Development Administration, that's helping distressed communities, including my hometown, which was what brought me into politics in the first place. How cool is that? I and my amazing team are able to help veterans who, are trying to just get the benefits that they've earned. How cool is that we're able to help people in that way? Congress, in the last Congress, passed the most significant climate change legislation in the history of the planet. How cool is that? And so there are real opportunities for impact. And yet, I think we can recognize that and at the same time say, we got to do better, because the challenges are profound. And if we want to be the country, the notion is, how do we build, we're not a perfect union, but the goal is to build a more perfect union. And that's going to take all of us.
Be a loving critic. I love the way that you reframed the last 50 minutes, because that's how I feel. But part of what I always like to do in these conversations is reflect what I think the listeners hear. And
Sure.
oftentimes in these conversations of fixing, they only take away the breakage. And I
Yeah.
think that whether you're a Democrat or Republican listening to this, I think we can all agree that the temperament that you share is a temperament that everybody should at least try to embody, because that's how we try to push the institution forward. So thank you so much,
You bet.
Congressman Kilmer, again for your time. I know it's very early on your side, and I appreciate you doing stuff even though it feels like the incentives don't necessarily incentivize those things.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much to Congressman Kilmer. Thank you for listening. As you saw from that conversation, we touched a lot of points, and I appreciated the congressman's time as it relates to the difficulties and challenges of our politics in our moment. I want you to emphasize that this was actually the second time we had this conversation. The Wi-Fi the first time was not so great, and that's where we started. If you appreciated the dialogue, support the show. YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Every Monday, we're releasing content. It's because of you that we're building this hopeful majority. And importantly, this hopeful majority is for everybody, not just Democrats, not just Republicans, people across the board, people that have different ideas, perspectives, nuanced beliefs, because we think that we need to have open minded conversations at a time of extreme division. I'll see you next week.